We're way up in the mountains, and the big thing here is the ice. The whole riverbed freezes, and the springs will generate what's called off ice, and it builds ice in the riverbed vertically, so that ice just gets thicker and thicker and thicker. This is kind of one of the quintessential Arctic trips. It goes from the source to the sea, you know.
Welcome to The Trail Less Traveled, an adventure radio series and podcast dedicated to collecting stories and sounds from around the world in order to take you back to mankind's earliest form of entertainment, storytelling. Missoula, Montana is a mecca for outdoor enthusiasts, and each week we will bring you tales of adventure from both near and far, as well as information and inspiration and a few tunes to set the mood. You can subscribe to the podcast and learn about our international outreach projects at traillesstraveled.net. And now, here's your host, International Expedition Guide, Conservationist, and Yogi, Mandela.
I'm standing in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge within a few hundred feet of the Hula Hula River. And right next to me is my friend and fellow guide, Kevin Thirsty McDermott. Many of us on the river call him Thirsty. Thirsty's been guiding since he was 16, which is well over 4 decades. He's been guiding here in Alaska for well over 3 decades. We're standing next to the fire. We're burning trash. First and foremost, I just want to say thanks, Thirsty, for agreeing to let me interview you after about 5 years of hinting that I wanted to do this.
You're welcome. I thought I could sneak out of it, but there's no getting out.
My first question for you is, where did you grow up, and how was adventure a part of your childhood?
I grew up in a couple different places in Colorado. Started out in Lamar, Colorado. I was involved in the Boy Scouts as a kid, and I went to a summer camp in San Isabel, Colorado, which is in the wet mountains near the town of San Isabel and over by Westcliff. And then later on, we moved over to the western slope of Colorado. I grew up in Palisade, Colorado, right on the Colorado River, on a peach orchard over there. And I continued going to the same summer camp, eventually working for that camp. And that camp had a rock climbing and rafting and backpacking program for older scouts. And that's kind of where I got going in my outdoor adventure world. My parents were not into outdoor stuff whatsoever. My dad was a farmer, though, and so he was outdoor all the time. So he didn't really see a whole lot of need in being outside any more than you had to. So anyway, I just got involved in Boy Scouts, and I just loved camping and being outside and doing all that kind of stuff, running around. And my dad he always made sure that I continued on in Scouts, I guess. He would take me over to camp from the western slope over to San Isabel after we moved over there. My mom was a nurse, and she wasn't interested in any kind of outdoor stuff at all.
Was there a moment in your early years where you had an epiphany where you're like, dang, I like being outside. I want to work outside. I want to do this professionally?
Working at that scout camp, I did, immediately. I was not good in school at all. I had no interest in anything in school. And I just knew that was what I wanted to do. In those days, there was probably a few people making a living at being a climbing guide or a rafting guide or whatever, but it wasn't something that was that real. And then eventually, as I worked my way up through working at the scout camp, into teenager and on into like 21 or so, I guess I did some of the managing jobs of working with the scouts, kind of ran the high adventure program at that camp. I pretty much knew then, I was working with other commercial guides on the Arkansas River, and I pretty much knew that's what I wanted to do. I didn't know how to put that together really with, how to actually make a living at it, which is what most guides were doing in those days, trying to figure out how you could do that. Most guides on the Arkansas River were, working the summer there and working ski seasons in the wintertime, which is what I eventually went on to do.
You love the mountains and you also love the rivers. I'm wondering what came first. Was it the rivers or the mountains? Or they kind of at the same time?
Kind of at the same time. Maybe even mountains a little ahead of that. Working at that camp, we had a lot of good granite rock to climb there, and so did a lot of rock climbing and just bouldering around when we weren't actually doing rock climbing classes and stuff. So was pretty into climbing in those days, but also going over and working on the river, which it was kind of a 10-day program. We had a ropes course there too, so you do a ropes course and then go out climbing for a couple days on the rock, and then out backpacking for 2 or 3 days, and then over on the river for 2 or 3 days. So a lot of it was more in the mountain. The camp there was like 8,000 feet or so in the wet mountains, and so it was up in the mountains, and I just loved living there and being there for the summer.
On this trip that we're on right now, we're on the Hula Hula River. You've shared a couple of stories about your early years guiding in Alaska, and you didn't always have inReach, and you didn't always have satellite telephones. So I was wondering if you could paint the picture of what it was like when you were starting to guide 30 years ago, but you were running expeditions like we are right now in the refuge.
I think that's one of the ways a lot of outdoor stuff has changed. It seems like it's becoming more and more reliant on technology and digital everything. In those days, we just spent a lot of time before we even got out here making sure that people knew that we needed to slow down and take our time out here, that any kind of injury or anything like that was going to be a major deal. So we just really took our time at trying to educate folks even before we would get out here of, just moving slow and doing things super slow and easy and taking our time and watching every step, so to speak. And then slowly the technology started coming in. The satellite phone came, and they weren't very good in the beginning, and you would be forced occasionally to lean on that, and it seems like all you would do is make a bunch of phone calls and nothing really would change. So, I still try to just lean back on kind of old school, just getting everybody to think about moving slow and taking our time out here and doing everything we can to mitigate any kind of injury or anything like that.
Was there ever an experience that you had in your early career where, say it was a close call or whatever it was, but you walked away from that experience learning a big lesson that definitely changed the way that you guided and, ran trips following that?
Maybe one of my first flipped boat on the Arkansas and Sunshine Falls down on the Royal Gorge. Had an injury that we thought could be a head injury, and so it turned into evacuating this person out kind of up the railroad tracks and up this steep trail, and got that person back to the hospital. They got looked at and they were just fine. It wasn't anything, but I don't know how old I was then, maybe 18. It was a big deal, just in your mind. Like, I can remember how I felt helping carry that person out, so you realize that you got to be safe out there. Your actions can change the way things happen, and just really trying to get people to work together out on the river so that everybody's being safe.
Well, when we come back, we're definitely going to talk about where we are right now, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the Hula Hula River. But I know that there was a journey to get to this river. So I'm wondering, what rivers in Alaska did you run before this one, and how did you end up here?
I was actually working on the Rio Grande down on the Texas-Mexican border in Big Bend National Park, running river trips there back when there was a river there to run. And there was a bunch of guides that I worked with down there. A few of them had worked in Alaska, and that's how I became interested in Alaska. I will say that a long, long time ago, before I even knew anything about rafting or any sort of climbing or rafting or any of that kind of stuff, I remember seeing a movie one time, which is actually a book called Never Cry Wolf. I remember the scenery in that movie was just, it's like, man, I got to go there. I got to see mountains like that. And, eventually on into scouts in that. And then it's just amazing that I, at some point, just became more interested in Alaska, not even thinking about any of that kind of Arctic stuff. And then the first time I came to Alaska was one of my greatest friends, my brother, Bob Gray, was doing some river trips out in western Alaska. They were fly-out fishing trips, and I got on one of those and came up for the first time. And then that same summer, I had another buddy that was over on the Nenana River down in Denali National Park. And at the end of that river trip, which was out on the Alagnak River, came over to Denali and ran some day trips there. And then just came back the following season to do day trips and stumbled into a company called Alaska Discovery that was doing trips and contracting trips with Sobek. And they were in need of a guide, and I got lucky and got to come up here to the Arctic and just fell in love with it immediately. So yeah, it was crazy to just think back on that movie and then and then end up there many years later.
Thirsty, we talked a little bit about your parents and where you grew up. I also wanted to create a space for you to mention any mentors that you may have had in your early years.
Yeah, there's been a lot over the years. My brother, Bobski, he's the one that got me into it. We worked at the Scouts together for a lot of years and kind of always looked up to him and got started with him. And we did a lot of trips together in different places. And gosh, there's, all the old Sobek hands, and Bart Henderson and Mike Speaks and all of those guys that kind of led the way in the whole Sobek world, really worldwide, doing the thing everywhere. Just always looked up to all of those guys.
We're here in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge at the headwaters of the Hula Hula River. And looking at my watch, it's 11:10 p.m. and the sun is still out. I'm looking out across the tundra, and there's one little hill that's lit up. It's pretty amazing. Have you actually witnessed the tundra turning green while you've been here?
Yeah, I think we see it every day. I think we've seen it on our trip here, just slowly getting a little green. It's been a really super cold spring in Alaska overall, but especially up here. And everything is, what are we? Middle of June, and yeah, it's just barely getting green. Usually it's a little ahead of this, and by the end of the next trip, it'll be just totally 100% emerald green. There's still a lot of yellows and grays and that kind of stuff out here right now, but we've been seeing flowers popping open and leaves becoming all the way fully green right in front of our eyes. So it's, with the daylight, everything's about 3 times as fast when it pops out because there's so much of it.
And that's on the surface, but one thing that I know I'm going to do before bed, I'm not sure what you're going to do, but I might go out into the tundra and dig a hole. But when you dig a hole out here, you hit something. Tell us about that.
Well, you don't have to dig very far and you run into permafrost. The ground here is super solid. So, it's like a big carpet on top. The tundra is all kinds of little plants that mesh together, all kinds of mosses and little flowers and all kinds of things. And then there's this really little thin layer of like real black kind of topsoil. And then you're right into the gravels and stuff. And as you get a little bit deeper than that, it's actually frozen.
It is almost 11 at night and bright where we're standing. We're right next to the headwaters of the Hula Hula River in the Brooks Range of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And I'm standing here next to my friend and fellow guide, Kevin Thirsty McDermott. And right now he's standing over a fire and we're burning rubbish, we're burning trash. And Thirsty, I was wondering if you could tell us maybe why we're burning trash and then where we are.
Well, we're burning trash to get rid of smells. We're up here on the Hula Hula. We're in bear country, and the bears up here just don't really know what any of those kind of smells are. And so we're trying to keep it that way by getting rid of smells out of cans and all the stuff that we're going to carry downstream with us over the next 7 or 10 days, and just try to keep everything clean. So all those cans will get smashed and reduced down into a small little thing that we take home, but all the smell will be out of them.
The truth is that the majority of the people who are listening right now will probably never come to this place. So I was wondering if I could ask you the most impossible question. If you could just look around, maybe we'll look downstream for a second, and if you could just try to paint the picture for people who are listening at home or in their car or in their shop working on their car. What does this place look like?
It's amazing. It's massive beyond belief. You know, the biggest thing is there's nothing here to give you any scale of how huge it is. Really, the only thing we have is when we get up high on the hike we did today, looking down and seeing our little tents and seeing the runway, gravel airstrip that we landed on. Occasionally you see an airplane go by and, you know, you kind of know how big that airplane is, and you see it way up in the air and realize how massive these mountains are and how big the Brooks Range is. You know, looking downstream here, we're total daylight, and the sun, which doesn't go down at this time of year, has just dipped behind one of these peaks here, which is a few thousand feet up over the river bottom that we're in. So we're in the shade now, and a little bit later on here, 2 o'clock or so in the morning, it'll pop back out in between a few of these peaks, or maybe downstream, down in the low part of the valley, and start shining again. It'll seem like it's daybreak, but it's only about 2 in the morning. It'll just keep doing that as it goes behind each peak and come out between.
And we're looking downstream right now. This river that's right next to us, where does it end up?
It ends up all the way out in the Arctic Ocean, in the Beaufort Sea. It's about 80 or 90 miles long. We're way up in the mountains, and out of a lot of the North Slope rivers, this is kind of one of the quintessential Arctic trips. It goes all the way from the source to the sea. You know, we start up high. It's pretty much just a creek out here just upstream of us, and it will get bigger and bigger and bigger as we go downstream. We'll go through some whitewater. We'll be in some big mountains. We'll hike a lot of big mountains. Mountains seem even bigger this year because the snow and the ice is so late melting, so there's a lot of snow around still. But we'll go all the way down through the mountains, and then right as we get through the whitewater stretch, which is in kind of a canyon, the mountains end, and we kind of dump out into the sort of rolling hills that are about half as high and kind of more rounded off. And then we get through there for a few days, and then all the way out on the coast where it's super flat, and then eventually all the way out to the ocean, which is a cool thing to do. We can take out just off the coast a little island out there called Airy Island, which is in the ocean out there, kind of just out in the flats, sand flats out there. But of course the big thing is we're way up above the Arctic Circle and the timberline and all that, so we don't have any trees. The biggest thing we see out here are the willow on the side of the river. So pretty unique mountains.
Another thing that's unique about this river, to give people perspective, because when they think of rivers, I don't think they necessarily think about what's downstream that you've been looking at with your binoculars today. So just tell us a little bit about running this river this time of year.
Well, the big thing here is the ice. And these rivers aren't huge rivers. They're kind of small. They're basically runoff rivers. So it snows here. I wouldn't say it snows a lot, but the snow that falls here in the wintertime stays all winter and gets blown around in the wind a lot. And so we get big snow drifts here. So yeah, the river kind of freezes in the winter, and then the whole riverbed freezes and builds ice throughout the winter. So after it's all frozen over, there's quite a few places in a lot of these rivers. All these mountains are limestone, so they're very porous and lots of water in them. And so there's a lot of springs. And so the springs will generate what's called off ice. And the off ice is basically caused from a spring in the riverbed. So after that river freezes, that spring continues to run, and it builds ice in the riverbed vertically. So that ice just gets thicker and thicker and thicker as it goes throughout the whole winter. And of course, it's cold and dark here for a lot of months out of the year, and it builds that off ice. And some years, it'll kind of almost cap itself off and not really build a whole lot of ice vertically. Other years, it just continues to flow and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It can be, 30 and 40 feet tall in places. And then when that breaks out in the spring and goes out, like right now for us on this trip is spring here for sure. The snow is just melting. We're seeing the ground snow just going away. It's late this year, but there's still a lot of snow up high. We're still seeing pieces of ice on the river banks on both sides, but we're seeing huge off-ice chunks. We saw one today, the big one downstream here, and they're really big this year. So right now, actually, it's not broken all the way through, so the challenge is to get through the ice that is broken, because that's super narrow where the water goes through there, finding a good channel that goes through. And then in the bigger places, that will be broke out later on in the trip as we get further downstream. We've had some warm weather, so it's definitely all melting. The water's coming up and pushing a lot of the ice through.
And there's a couple of other unique aspects of this river: wind, the mosquitoes, the wildlife, and one big thing for a lot of river runners is the factor of weight when it comes to the planes.
The weight is the tricky part. Getting everything in here is a huge deal. So, we kind of run our trips as paddle boats so that we don't have frames and oars and all that kind of extra stuff. We're allowed to bring 8 guests with us up here. So there's 2 guides and 8 guests, total of 10, in 2 paddle boats. We run usually 16-foot paddle boats. We just have a big gear floor that's in the center, and we have 4 people paddling the boat and 1 guide. Yeah, the trick is to, as river folks, we like to do some pretty nice food and that kind of thing out here. But this is a lot less Grand Canyon style, almost more backpacking style. And you try to find some little balance there in between the two. But yeah, getting the weight in the airplane and getting in here is a huge challenge on both ends of the trip, coming and going. If you know what the weights of everything are, and trying to keep that as low as you can so you can get in here.
And then, wildlife from the small. It seems to be windy here, or those guys come out. We're lucky right now. I feel like now that I've said that, these massive Arctic mosquitoes are going to come out. Can you tell us a little bit about those factors?
Well, the mosquito is up here. They are definitely here. We have to think positive about those guys. They're pollinators, so that's good. But they can be fairly annoying. There is a lot of wind here, so that is good. The wind does keep the bugs down. We're camped in the riverbed, mainly on gravel bars and that kind of thing. That helps keep the mosquitoes away from you. But it can be bad at times. It's usually when it warms up more. We're having a late spring, so cooler weather up here, but it has been super warm already, which means we're already seeing them. They could be potentially kind of gnarly on like our next trip that comes right after this one. We're usually out of here on the second trip on like 4th of July or so, and that's when they can become bad. You wouldn't want to be here in middle of July or end of July when it's kind of at its warmest, and they're all over the place here then.
And then on the other side of the spectrum, we've got some big brown bears and some big white bears out here. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, there are some grizzlies out and about. We see those guys cruising around. It takes a really big chunk of land up here for those guys to make it. So we definitely see bears. There's very few people that run these rivers each year. So these bears are not tuned in whatsoever to what we are or what we're doing or our food or, any kind of that human smell stuff. They just don't know what that is. So that's kind of one of our goals as stewards of this place, is to try to keep our camps clean and really take care of the place and keep them from getting turned on to that kind of thing. And then the other bear we have up here, the big white guy, polar bears, we occasionally see down at the coast. The Kaktovik, where part of our takeout happens, is out on Barter Island, and Kaktovik was historically a whaling village out there, and they still are allowed to get a whale out there, and they do that every year. And there's kind of a big butcher yard down there where they butcher the whale and do their ceremonies and that kind of thing. And in that little lagoon out there, a lot of times you'll see polar bears out there that are kind of habituated to that village, and they kind of stick around there a little more, especially when they miss the ice. But where we're at here, going down the Hula as we get out toward Airy Island, a lot of times when we get out on the island, we can see sign of polar bear prints, that kind of thing. Depending on where the ice is, a lot of times in the field glasses, you can look out on the ice and see the seals out there, of course, that they're after. And occasionally you'll see a polar bear out there cruising around on the ice.
That's the voice of Thirsty. He's my friend and fellow guide here on the Hula Hula River. We are standing in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge at the headwaters of the Hula Hula right now. And before we wrap up this segment, I would like to just ask you quickly about the other river that you guide on in southeast Alaska, the Alsek. That's the first time I guided in Alaska with you was on that river, but it's a bit different than this one.
It is a bit different. It's massive. Massive compared to here. You look at the whole river right out here in front of us, it could be equal to just one small little braid of hundreds of braids on that river. So yeah, it's a big one down there. People ask about the difference between the two trips, and we always talk about wildlife and terrain and that kind of thing. And we always say down there, it's more about glaciers and seeing glaciers and that kind of ice, and not that we don't see ice up here. And there are some small glaciers up here that we see also in the higher mountains. But, up here it's in some ways kind of more about seeing wildlife. I mean, hiking in the mountains and doing the same thing, but down there, it's just seeing the glaciers is a big deal.
Thirsty, after 30 plus years of guiding up here, what have these landscapes taught you?
They keep you pretty humble. It's so massive and so much bigger than we are, It just teaches you how to keep things very simple, down to the way we run the river here, just keeping things super simple and protecting and keeping after, your camp and your fire source and your water source and all those different things. Just back to really basic things that we take for granted in a lot of other places.
I'm currently walking in the Tundra, located in the Brooks Range of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's 11:30 p.m., but the sun is in the sky, it's bright out, and I'm here with Kevin, Thirsty, McDermott. Thirsty, what are we walking on right now?
We are on Grasser's Airstrip, which is kind of the put-in, one of the main put-ins for the Hula Hula River. It's a short little strip, used to be a little longer, but the river here, of course, comes up and down all the time pretty radically and washes a lot of these airstrips out. So this one used to be one of the longer strips around, and it's quite a bit shorter, but still one of the longer ones around, which is nice.
To be able to do these adventures, both on rivers and in mountains, it's super important to have the support of your family. And in this particular situation, I'm talking about Darla, your wife. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about family support and Darla.
Yeah, she's the best. At a certain point, as a young guide, you go through a whole stage where, you feel like maybe some guides have gone to school and feel like they spend a lot of time going to school and they're not using the school and they should use the school, and some haven't gone to school. I never went to school or any of that, but you go through the stages of just thinking that you should do something else or should get a real job. And I've been with Darla since high school, and so she's been through the whole guiding thing herself with me, and she's just always kept me realizing that this is really what I want to do. And she's just been the support behind making all that happen and telling me how I wouldn't be happy doing something else. And she's absolutely right. I'm glad that I've stuck with it my whole life.
Thirsty, you also love mountains. And we're looking at some pretty impressive mountains around us right now. It's spring in the Arctic. But I wanted to talk to you in particular about Denali. You climbed Denali. It took 3 attempts, if I'm not mistaken. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, Denali is a great mountain. I worked with some guides down in Denali National Park on the Nenana River that had been up on Denali. Al Cockman is a good friend of mine who had been up there before, and there was a few of us that were interested in going out and doing a climb. So we were all boaters, rafters that went out and climbed. We put together 3 different climbs and just kept at it. We always went out early was our thing, and Denali's a very cold mountain. So when you go out in April and May, that's kind of a little ahead of the climbing season. But since we were all rafters, we were trying to get out there and do the climb and get back so that we could go to work on the Nenana and pay for the climb. We just wanted to go out there and have a good time on the mountain. Our goals were always to go out there and come back in one piece with 10 fingers and 10 toes and remain friends. And that's a handful to pull off out there. So we went out the first time, and we made it up to about 16,000 or so, a little over 16, and turned back because of weather. Lots and lots of bad weather at that time of year. Still big storms moving through. We did the West Buttress climb all 3 times, and we would ski up the northeast fork of the Kahiltna Glacier. We skied to about 11,000 and then climbed from there. And the first climb we made it to about a little over 16, and then second climb we made it all the way up to high camp, which is 17.2, and then third time was a charm. Finally got up there, but lots of epicness out there, lots of big storms and really, really cold weather and lots of snow and all of it.
When you say you got up there, what's the exact elevation of Denali's summit?
20,320.
Now, I've definitely heard you say before on trips, I've experienced 70 below. I'm not doing that again.
Yeah, I mean, it can be super cold out there, and Denali is one of the colder mountains that people climb in the world. So there's some very, very cold temperatures. Not uncommon for it even during the climbing season when it's warmer, like in June, and when the bulk of the climbers are out there, it's still not uncommon for it to dip into the 20, 30, 40 below as storms rage through there. You're kind of way up high in the jet stream and a lot of big wind and a lot of freezing temperatures. It's pretty far north compared to, a lot of the Himalaya and that kind of thing that's down by the equator.
Tell us a little bit more about that. You're comparing Mount Everest to Denali in terms of elevation, yet conditions are a little bit different.
Yeah, it's the cold. The farther north you are of the equator, you're being up that high. They say that 20,000 on Denali is a lot like way up above 20,000 in the Himalaya, and it's just because you're farther north in latitude.
So thirsty. I've sat down with quite a lot of boatmen here in Alaska talking about the glacial rivers up here and getting some tips in terms of running glacier rivers and reading glacier rivers. Can you share something with us in terms of reading this water, versus like the Middle Fork of the Salmon or the Grand Canyon? What are some of the differences and challenges?
A lot of the stuff that we run up here, whether it's glacial or partially glaciated, like some of the stuff in the Brooks Range here, these are kind of more runoff rivers. Here on the Hula, we have a little glacier ice up high that feeds some of this. But, the biggest thing is just the silt and reading the water, as the water is gray. It seems like everything in the riverbed is gray. The rocks, right now even the vegetation is gray. But the water and the rocks, and of course up here there's a lot of big braided rivers. And I think one of the things that helps you understand the river here is to think about how kind of the ice goes out of here. and the way the ice moves some of these channels around. And that's kind of one of the challenges of working up here, is just the way things move and change every year. There is never, ever a time that you come out and run the same exact river every year. The river radically changes every time. So even though it's the same river bed, the channels change, the gravels are always moving, the rocks are moving, the cobbles moving, way more than a lot of other places. And the first thing that does that is the ice. As the ice goes out, it really pushes a lot of that stuff around and moves it. And I think part of what that does is it keeps a lot of the riverbed, and the sands and the silts and the cobble and gravels sort of saturated. They're not compacted down into the bottom. And so those sands and silts move around, and you just have to kind of key into reading that stuff and sort of watching what the channels do. It's always moving. I mean, we hear the rocks and stuff moving as we go downstream underneath us. And, you know, you generally go with the bigger channels and work in through the smaller ones. And a lot of times you're trying to choose from 3 or 4 or 5 or 8 that are like basically look the same size. And a lot of what you look at is the lay of the riverbed and which way a lot of those braids fall to, if they fall to the left or fall to the right. Trying to just have some of those clue you into which direction you're going. You're not only looking at where the water's going, but where overall the water's headed eventually.
Beautiful. One thing that many people listening might not know about you is your passion for Land Cruisers. So just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what you do in the winter and how long you've been into fixing up old Land Cruisers.
Well, I do love old Land Cruisers. I'm always looking at them, always wanting them, trying to, I guess make the ones I drive better and that kind of thing. And yeah, it's just kind of a hobby, just tinkering around with those kind of things. Mechanical. They're pretty amazing machines.
Let's end your show with 3 pieces of advice: life advice, adventure advice, Alaska advice, any kind of advice. For example, what kind of peanut butter should we bring to the Arctic?
Don't bring any of that fancy peanut butter you got to stir. That's one piece of advice. Just not getting separated from your stuff and being ready for anything to go down. I mean, once you start flying around in airplanes and we come out here on some of these river trips, and we, like on this one, and we just talked to one of the other groups that came out here not knowing exactly what river you were going to start on. So just kind of being overall ready for anything, which, I think is kind of a river guide's thing in general. I think all of us kind of shoot for being ready for anything.
Any advice for dealing with mosquitoes?
Mosquitoes are a mindset. I mean, you can put all kinds of sauces and creams on yourself and whatever, but to deal with bugs here, you have to have the mindset to just not let them bother you, because they will if you let them, especially doing this kind of work. They're around you at the stove, they're getting behind your glasses, they're chewing you up. You just have to not let them bother you.
Mosquitoes are a mindset. I need to make a shirt that says that. Well, Thirsty, after 5 years of subtly hinting and eventually really nudging strongly, thank you for finally letting me interview you here in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And I just want to say that it has been an honor to work up here with you in Alaska. You're certainly a mentor to me, and it's been such a privilege to be able to learn from you in this ecosystem. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything that you've taught me.
You bet. I hope to do a lot more with you. There's lots of rivers left up here.
Hi there. My name is Ryan, and I'm a teaching naturalist for the Montana Natural History Center. Our mission is to promote and cultivate the appreciation, understanding, and stewardship of nature through education. My naturalist tip of the week is to try and avoid being a point-and-shoot naturalist. In other words, try to learn more about the natural world apart from just being able to identify the names of different things. Just learned a new bird call? Try and read about what kinds of habitats that bird gravitates towards. A new flower? Figure out what pollinators specialize on it. Even just one or two additional facts about an organism can help you to gain a better understanding of local ecology and will help you to remember the organism better too. For more information and to become a member of the Montana Natural History Center, visit montananaturalist.org. That's montananaturalist.org.
That's it for this week's adventure, my friends in Missoula and around the world. But until next week, please remember, conservation is not a spectator sport. Living in Missoula is a privilege. With privilege comes responsibility. Please get educated and engaged. Speak up on behalf of wildlife and wild places. And if you think you're too small to make a difference, well, then you've never spent the night with a mosquito.